Good morning, Illini. Welcome back to another Healthy Illini podcast. I'm your host, as always, Matt Schrock. And yeah, we've been gone for a couple weeks. Sometimes life happens and things pop up that you can't control. And so we do apologize for that break. But we talk about being authentic and real on this podcast a lot. And so I'm being authentic and real with you today that we did have a little bit of an unexpected break. But we're back and we're excited to get back into it. Have a great topic this morning. So I'm glad you're with us. Today I have three guests with me, and we are talking about some ideas around gender and sexuality and identity, and we'll get into more of what those are in just a minute. But first I want to welcome our guests. First up is Elise Lanker. She is a clinical counselor at the Counseling Center. She has a bachelor's in psychology and master's in social work, and she's the co-chair of the Counseling Center outreach team, Queers and Allies, or Q&A. Elise, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Next up, we have Alex Rosado Torres. He is the Assistant Director of the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, has a bachelor's in History and Education, a master's in Education Policy with Diversity and Equity in Education, and is currently a PhD student here at UIUC in History of Education and Queer Studies. Alex, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And rounding out my trio, we have a student who's joining us today, Atlas Fuller. They are a junior and studying integrative biology and plant biotech. Atlas, I'm thrilled to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, so as I said, we're talking about gender, sexuality, and identity. And as with most topics we talk about here on Healthy Illini, that is way more complex and involved than we could ever cover in 100 podcasts, let alone one that's about 15 to 20 minutes. So we're going to look at a very specific part of that whole conversation. So if you're listening and you're like, well, what about this? What about that? We hope to get to some of those ideas in future podcasts. We're in some talks about some things. But for today, the very specific part that we want to talk about is the concepts of coming out and being an ally. So for this conversation, I'm consciously making the assumption that it's from the vantage point of someone who knows their identity and is pretty secure in that knowledge. So like I said, we're working on scheduling another podcast that will focus more on the journey of finding and acknowledging that identity. But for today, that piece has already been worked through or mostly worked through. So for every topic we talk about here, I always try and offer a space to present authentic and relatable perspectives, especially from students whenever we can. So I want to start really giving that space for some personal storytelling, if that's okay, and start with Atlas, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
So Alex and Elise, feel free to jump in as well. But Atlas, can you share a little bit about your own experiences in sharing your identity with others, and what were some of the thoughts and emotions you felt and had to address during that time?
Yeah, so I am very lucky to have many of the letters in the LGBT acronym. I am trans, intersex, and non-binary. So to essentially break that down, I was born with a faulty Y chromosome, so I have a lot of female characteristics and male characteristics, so it's pretty obvious for a lot of people that I'm somewhere in between. I am also actively making efforts to make my body appear more feminine, so that's the trans part. And then the non-binary part is that I don't necessarily identify as either male or female. So I'm, collecting a bunch of identities right now, and sometimes it's a little bit confusing for some people to track. But when I came out very recently, specifically with the trans and non-binary part. I mean, those are the least obvious of the three. I lived in a very rural town that was very, Republican, conservative, very red town. So I was essentially not allowed to live as myself for a very long time. I had to, dress very masculine. I had to appear masculine. I had to actually speak with a fake voice for a long time, which I'm still learning to talk in my natural voice. So it was very difficult for a long time existing just as myself naturally. So when I moved to UIUC this year, I could finally express myself in a way that I felt was more natural. So I came out to all of my friends specifically with all those things, but I only came out to my friends. I did not tell a soul back from my hometown what was going on. I didn't want anyone back there to know, because I know if they heard about it, I wouldn't be welcomed back into that community. So it was a lot of picking and choosing exactly who to come out to. And that was one of the biggest things for me, was deciding who I could tell and who would be okay to tell. And when I did tell them, I had to be very specific in that this is just between you and me, and this is only here on this campus. If we go somewhere else, I want to be referred to as my old name. I want to be called he, him pronouns, all that. I do not want anyone else to know. So it's a very selective process, at least for me. Now, for some people, it's obviously not. I mean, if they have a more accepting family or come from a bigger town, it's probably more easy for them to come out. But for people like me who grew up in very constricted communities, it's definitely a bit more of a challenge.
And that's, you said this is for you, and that's something that we talk about in a lot of our episodes, is that everyone has a personal journey, everyone has a unique journey, and there are commonalities for everyone. Every person you come in contact with, you have some sort of commonality in some way, and even if it's the most common, you have the most things in common, there's still little things that are different. It's your own personal journey. So if someone's listening is like, well, that's not quite how I feel, that's okay. That's not quite your journey. It's not your journey. This is Atlas's journey. But coming back to that, when you said you came out to very specific people in specific times, was that a tough process for you to decide, or was that something that was like, okay, now I'm going to do it, or was it like, I'm going to do it? And I know in my own life, sometimes I make a decision, but it takes me a week to follow through on that decision.
I feel that.
Even though I know that's the right decision, but to get to that next step is a whole nother conversation. Was that kind of what your process was for that? Yeah,
it was a very gradual process. I kind of did it in layers. So I'd come out to my very best friend first, and then once she was like, oh yeah, that's really cool, I felt a little bit more comfortable kind of coming out to more people. And very, very gradually, it took about a month to fully come out to like everyone here on campus that I know. And now I just live as myself. So pretty much everyone that's seen me in public, that I don't know, just sees me as me now. So I don't really have to come out to those people, which was a really good feeling, because, they don't need to see me as how I was seen, I guess, when I lived in my hometown, if that makes sense. So yeah,
that actually segues a little bit into something, Alex, you talked about in your in the prep work that we did, that there's a balance between the importance of visibility in the community and supporting the community through visibility and being authentic in who you are, wherever you are, but also balancing that with, privacy is still a thing. And this is an individual. This is not a mascot. This is not a representative for everyone all the time. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to share a little bit about that, what that balance is like, or how you kind of approach that balance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we live in a society where, our identities are so important to who we are, right? We carry our identities with us in every aspect of our life, professionally, personally, right? With our friends, with our family. And I think because of that, sometimes people think that our identities and sharing our identities is owed to people, right? But the truth is that it isn't. And sort of as Atlas has shared, now they're at a point in their lives where the people around them, they're not actively coming out to them, right? Because Atlas doesn't owe them that, right, to come out to them. And I mean, I think about the same for me, right? I'm assistant director of our Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, and I'm sure that comes with a lot of assumptions about my identities, right? But the truth is that if I don't want to share, right, what identities I occupy, I don't have to. And that's the beauty of coming out or not coming out, right? And that's part of the beauty of carrying, these complex and these multiple identities that we all have.
And it also comes back to the individual journey, that some people are extroverts, some people are introverts, and that happens in whatever community of identity you want to talk about. Yeah. And some people, like, I'm an extrovert. You want to know what I'm dealing with, what I'm going through? 90% of it, I will be like, here you go, here it is, because I don't care. I have a brother who's very much an introvert, and he's quite the opposite. And and again, I say we have very commonalities. We have the same parents, grew up in the same household, we graduated from the same high school, but we're very different people in this particular way. And that happens in all communities, including the community we're talking about today. Yeah. So how do you... So I know in talking to a lot of people that you can feel pressure both ways. Pressure to come out and pressure to not come out, based on who you're with and things like that. How do you navigate that internally? Not necessarily how do you navigate being around people, but internally, what's that conversation with yourself of when you do and when you don't, and how you deal with that pressure?
I would say I had a lot of experience with the pressure to not come out, specifically because my previous employer, I worked at a greenhouse for 4 years. It was my favorite job, but my employer was very, very conservative. He was one of the COVID is a hoax people. So he was very strange. And I know for a fact, if I even told him I was intersex, which is something I can't even control, he would probably just straight up fire me. So it was one of those things. I didn't want to lose my job. I didn't want to go through this process of having to explain to people why I don't work there anymore. I didn't want to do any of that. So I figured it would just be easier if I just stayed masculine and just didn't say anything. And that was true for a lot of the people in my community. So I knew if I did say anything, I would be ostracized and I wouldn't be taken seriously, and it would just be a bad time overall. So overall, I just decided I can't do that here. I need to just suppress all that and live my life until I can move away and then be myself. And then after that, now it's a personal choice of who sees me, how I want to be seen.
Yeah, if you don't, I want to speak to that as well. I definitely have contexts where I do not want to share anything about my identities or come out. But lately in my adulthood, I find I run more in circles where being queer is accepted, and I'm a queer woman, I'm a bisexual woman. But because it's not very visible and you might not read that about me, I feel a pressure to like make sure that people know. Because I'm hanging out with other queer people, I want them to know, hey, I'm queer too. We're all queer. We're all cool, right? But since it's not always visible, there's a little bit of that balance between like, is this for me? Is this for other people? Is this going to build connection? Or is this just because I feel like I don't appear queer enough? So I think there are a lot of internal questions I ask myself about when I feel pressured to share more about my identities, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And if I could chime in too, I feel like I have a different perspective as someone who works right in our Gender and Sexuality Resource Center on campus. Recently, we celebrated National Coming Out Day, which was October 11th. And National Coming Out Day is all about celebrating visibility and being out and proud and loud. And internally, right, at the center, we were having conversations of, well, do we want to make it all about being out and loud and proud? What about the students who maybe aren't there yet, right, or don't want to be there yet? And so we were having a lot of conversations within our own staff about how do we balance that, and as we work on our programming, right, in center, how do we include all of our students, not just the ones who are ready to be, front lines at pride parades, right? And so we've been having conversations about creating spaces that are inclusive for everyone, right, whether you are ready to be out or not, because we know that that is the diversity of our community and, the experiences of everyone who's part of it.
That comes to another point that you all talked about, is kind of getting away from the idea of being out is a singular momentary thing, that you all talked about is not a one and done proposition. It's a continual journey. It's a continual progression of, like I shared with this person, do I share with the next person, all those things. And it can be a beautiful process. It can be a grueling process. It can be both at the same time. It's a very complex thing. And so if somebody's listening, they're like, well, I'm not at that stage yet. That's okay. I mean, at least you just mentioned it, that as you've gotten older, you've gotten more comfortable. That means that it's been a journey. It wasn't, it wasn't a moment where, okay, everything's, what it is now. It's still a continual process. And that's something that I think you all have shared in your prep work, that it's very important to understand that it is a continual, and it's okay to change a little bit. It's okay to, who you are today and how you feel about today might not be who you are tomorrow, and how you feel about it tomorrow as far as your journey, and that's okay. But it's creating those safe spaces. So we've talked a little bit about the coming out side of it. But the other part of this conversation I really want to get to, because there's a lot of students that are listening going, yeah, that's me on my journey. I'm trying to figure out who to share with. I'm trying to figure out when to share with it. There's a lot of students going, that's not me, but I want to be a friend to somebody who is, or I want to help the community, but I don't really know how to do it. So can you just dive a little bit? They want to be an ally. Can you just dive a little bit more into what it means to be an ally?
Maybe I can kick us off. But I think a way that I approach it, and maybe a lot of others do, is instead of thinking about ally as a noun or even identity, thinking about ally rather as a verb or an action, a constant process, kind of like coming out. It's dynamic, it's fluid, it's not really something you arrive at, but that you're constantly working at, because there's really no perfection in allyship. We kind of have to have the humility to know that we'll never quite know everything, and that's okay, but also that there's maybe a base level of learning that we want to achieve. So I'd first kind of encourage folks to think about, okay, not I'm being an ally, but how do I ally in my day-to-day? How do my goals, values reflect allying throughout my lifetime?
Yeah, absolutely. And building upon that, right, I think that it's an acknowledgement that, sort of as Elise has alluded to, that it's a learning and an unlearning process, right, equally. There are many ways in which we have all, right, been socialized whether it's through our family or the environments that we grew up in, or, you know, the schools that we attended, where we receive certain messages about gender, sexuality, right, and other identities as well. And, you know, we learned those things, right? And maybe it's time for us to unpack it, to unlearn it, and maybe what we learned, right, was aligned with the experiences of the people around us, right? It is up to the individual person to sort of assess that situation. But having that humility, right, to sort of sit there and engage in that learning process, regardless of how old you are, right, regardless of your education level, because even me in my role, right, I work at our Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, but I've learned so much from our students, right, and hearing from their perspectives about, you know, our queer student needs right now are different than from when I was a student, right? And me taking that information in has been really helpful, and has allowed us to do more programming and meet our students where they're at. Because even within our community, right, terms are changing and terminologies and identities, and so you know, being an ally and allying oneself to the LGBT community, it's an ongoing process and it's very complex.
Yeah, I actually have two things. One of the biggest things with my coming out was like, I don't care if people make mistakes. That's not a big deal to me. I couldn't honestly care less if somebody uses the wrong pronouns like once or twice. It doesn't matter. The only time I would ever be mad or upset if somebody makes a mistake is if they perpetually do it on purpose and they are actively trying to be just hateful, I guess. That's the only time I would ever be upset. I don't think it would be reasonable to get upset for somebody like for messing up a pronoun, because it's just one of those things. We grow up like, especially in people that live in a town like mine, you grow up thinking there's only he and her and that's it. There's no other options. And when you have to relearn all that, you know, other pronouns and things like that, it's very difficult just getting the words to come out right sometimes. And I would never fault somebody for accidentally doing something like that, as long as it's not on purpose continually. And another thing, I forgot what I was going to say. Hold on just a second. Okay, so yeah, one of the biggest things that I think is best in allyship is you don't have to go out and fight battles all the time. A lot of being a good ally is just being a good friend. So being a kind person to your friends that are in the queer community, facilitating queer happiness is a really good thing. The biggest protest of all is just staying at home and being happy as yourself, because that's what people that don't like you don't want to happen. So being a good friend is really the best thing you can do.
Yeah, and I actually want to build up on a point that Atlas brought up. You know, here at our center, right, we have a tagline of assume best intention, right? So when we're training our student leaders, when we're training our student employees as well, and we tell them, you know, you're going to go out and table in the quad, right? You're going to go out and interact with all of our students and all of our faculty. Sometimes people are going to get things wrong. It's okay, because we're going to assume best intention, right? And we're going to approach the situation as, well, you know, by the way, my pronouns are actually this if it's a misgendering situation, or by the way, we actually use this terminology instead, right? And don't, you know, approach it from a very educational, right, standpoint, a very sort of, hey, just double checking, this is actually what we use now. And you give that person, right, who maybe made the mistake, an opportunity to acknowledge that mistake, to own up to that mistake, and to learn from it, right, without having to turn it into a hostile or a tense situation. And so assume best intention always is what we like to say.
I think that's huge what you both said, because from my perspective, I'm not part of this community. I am white, male, cis, hetero. I mean, I'm, you know, all the things. And we've all heard the horrible stories of discrimination, of attacks, you know, things like that. And so for me, I don't want to accidentally even come close to that side of something unintentionally, but yet I'm sitting here and I'm learning that, you know, to say to ally is better to say than be an ally. And even though it's a simple thing and I don't feel any attack from anybody, internally I'm feeling that angst when I heard that. I'm like, oh, okay, I've screwed that up. And so having that open communication, I think, is key. And there are, because people with best intentions don't want to mess anything up, and so sometimes that can be a hurdle that you can't cross, because there's a fear of, and not just in this situation, all kinds of situations, you know, fear, anxiety, fear of failure, those kinds of things. And so it's really, I really appreciate hearing that the way you're approaching it and the way the center approaches it with, best intentions. And it was also really encouraging, something that, Alex, we talked about before we got on air, about there was a name change at your center and why there was that name change. And it was really interesting. So if you would share a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who have been part of our campus community right before this fall, our center, which is the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, was known as the LGBT Resource Center. And as of July 1st, 2022, we are officially the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center. And part of the reason we decided to go with this name change is because we understand that our current student population, as well as our faculty and staff, right, and general community, they align with more expansive identities, right? And we realized that the term LGBT, which is what we were using, wasn't in capturing everyone within our community, right? Knowing that non-binary people or asexual and aromantic people didn't fit into the LGBT acronym, right? And so how do we move to a space, right? And how do we move to adopting language that meets everyone, right? And that is truly inclusive. And so it's a small change, right? But we're hoping that it is a mighty change that sort of encaptures and encourages more people to come out to us, especially because we are also for allies, right? Our space is for those who want to learn, right? Who want to ally themselves with our community. And so we're hoping that we are open to that and that people, come meet us where we're at as well.
That tails into something else you said, that allyship is complex, and you talked a lot in the prep work that we did about an intersectional perspective, if I could say that. Would you want to share a little bit about what that means? Because I've heard intersectional, but I don't, I myself, I don't fully understand. I admit that. So I'd love to have you share a little bit more about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So intersectional, right? It is mainly a theoretical framework, right, that comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, as well as the Combahee River Collective. And it really talks about how all of our identities, they don't exist in silos, right? Our gender and our sexuality do not stand alone. With that comes our racial identities, our class status, our ability, and so forth. And so for us, when we talk about allyship, we really like to think about that, because to ally oneself with the LGBT community isn't just allying oneself with issues of gender and sexuality, because LGBT people are complex, right? There are Black LGBT people, white LGBT people, right? Mixed race LGBT people, and all these people have different needs based on their different identities, right? And so by thinking about intersectionality and centering it, we can hopefully move to an allyship movement and a solidarity movement that is deeply diverse, right, and deeply considers the needs of everyone, right? Because when we do consider the needs of the most marginalized within our community, we subsequently capture everyone else, right? And so that's sort of a very quick mini rundown. There are whole classes on intersectionality and things like that, but hopefully that sets a nice foundation.
It's fantastic. Elise, you talked about, and with that idea of intersectionality, you talked about introspection a little bit, and how important that is, and really being kind to yourself. How does, even if you're not part of the community, how does introspection play a part in in that allyship?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's really a huge part of it, because really the easiest, or sometimes hardest place, is to start with yourself, right? Like, what do I think about gender and sexuality? Where did I learn these messages about what it means to be a man or a woman, what it means to be heterosexual? Like, why do I assume what my sexuality is? Have I ever asked myself questions or explored it, right? Identity development is actually a really natural psychological process that we all go through, but because of a lot of social and cultural messaging, we kind of assume a lot of things about ourselves or others. And so I invite everyone, even if you are not queer, even if you are cisgender, right, to just think about, like, how did I come to know I am who I am? Where did I learn that? Maybe push on that a little bit, not to necessarily make any changes, but just to better connect with yourself. And through that process, you will better be able to understand other people and how they explore their own gender and sexuality.
That's really cool. I like that.
And like, you'd be surprised what you learn, right? I think that I think we live in a society where learning is capped, right? You're done with school, you're done learning, right? But you can learn so much about yourself at all stages of life. And so I recommend practicing what Elise has stated with us.
It reminds me of something that my dad who's now passed on. But he taught me at a very young age. He said, every person you come in contact with, you learn something from. Either you learn, hey, I want to be like that person. What are they doing? Or I don't want to be like the person. What do I not need to want to do? And so every situation you come across, you can learn. He was a proponent of lifelong learning as well. And when we're talking about this identity, that's an important thing too, because I'm 44 years old. Who I am at 44 is not who I was at 34, or certainly not who I was at 24. I'm not even who I was at 43. And so that continual introspection, that continual just checking on yourself, and not in a critical way, because that's the other thing you talked about. We're real good. If I sat down and I asked us all to make a list of 5 things we liked about each other, that'd be super easy. 5 things you don't like, or that'd be super easy. 5 things you don't like about yourself, that'd be super easy. Flip it, and 5 things you like about yourself, we always sit here and go, because it's that worthy or whatever. So that introspection is really, really important, and I think you're all representing that really well today. Well, I would love to sit and talk to you for like a couple more hours, because this has been fantastic. Just really, really interesting and informative, but also very authentic and real, and I appreciate that. But unfortunately, we are out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up here. But Elise, Alex, Atlas, thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
As we say a lot here, everyone's on a personal journey. And as was represented today, that those personal journeys, while have similarities, they have a lot of differences as well. And part of the adventure, and part of the fun of the adventure, honestly, is finding out what your unique journey looks like. And so if you have questions today, if you're not certain where you're at in that journey, you want to talk to somebody, you want to ask more questions, you want to just follow up a little bit, feel free to reach out to us. We'll have some resources in the bio as always. You can check that out. You can contact us here at McKinley, contact us at Healthy Illini. I know that you could contact Alex and Elise, and they'd be happy to talk to you. If you see Atlas around, stop and say hi. But follow up, because we want to continue the conversation. Again, this whole point is to start the conversation and give us a safe space to talk about whatever topic we have that day. But thank you for joining us today. You're on a personal journey no matter where you are in it. You're important and you matter. Your health and wellness are important and matter, and we are here to keep you well to excel. So go have a great week, Illini. Let us know how you're doing, and we'll catch you next time on Healthy Illini.